Hello and welcome to the podcast. My name's Eleni Woods, and today on Fieldwork Diaries we are joined by Matt Kent, who is a biogeochemist at the Open University doing PhD research. Hiya Matt, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
I'm really excited actually about talking to you because I know a little bit about your research, and you've done some really fascinating things over the last few years.
Yeah, it's been very exciting.
Yeah, so why don't we get going? And do you want to introduce what you actually are studying?
Sure. So I'm looking at the effects of deforestation and drainage of peat swamp forests in Indonesia. So most people know peat swamp forests because of their populations of orangutans. They're really, really interesting places. But what people don't know too much about them is the fact that they're really vast ancient carbon stores.
So where is this carbon being stored? So is that in the soils themselves, or?
So precisely, in the forest above the soil, there's plenty of carbon. But what's actually been happening in the soil is because there's so much water, it's a swamp, that kind of acts as a barrier to oxygen and that prevents degradation.
Okay.
So what happens are the plants actually, when they die, they fall into the water, they're submerged, and that means that they can't be broken down. So gradually, this organic matter just accumulates over time, and now you could dig a hole 20 metres deep just into this soil. It's really an
That's amazing.
place.
You have it kind of all shut off in a way, and like you said, like a carbon store.
Exactly.
So you go out there to do your field work. What's that like?
It was completely outside anything I'd ever experienced before. I'm actually quite a big fan of peatlands in this country. You know, like their cousins that we have here are just like covered in moss, and it's just one of those places where you've probably lost a boot.
Yeah.
You know, like 10 or 15 times.
Yeah.
But yeah, just to kind of see what these tropical swamp forests were like was just completely extraordinary, because it's the same sort of thing. It's the same soil,
sure.
except it's covered in trees, and there's, like I said, orangutan or gibbons, red langurs, clouded leopards.
Oh, it sounds amazing.
And what's really exciting about it as well is you've got like dragonflies and all sorts of interesting insects and things that can almost transport you back and kind of imagine what the swamps of the Carboniferous were like.
That's amazing. Is it sort of all this untouched and beautiful?
Well, that's where my research comes in, actually, because a lot of swamp forest is found in developing countries.
Mm-hmm.
And so in order to boost their economies, the governments of these tropical countries look to exploit their natural resources.
Right.
And swamps, I mean, you know, even working in the swamps, you kind of think, God, there's lots of life here, but there's not much else you can do apart from being bitten by mosquitoes.
Who wants to work in a swamp or live in a swamp?
No,
Yeah.
They're actually, they're pretty hostile in a way. You know, they're not mega dangerous, but, it's not somewhere where it's particularly comfortable to hang out.
No.
You know? So that's how the people and also the governments kind of feel a bit about them, and so they think, well, it's a bit swampy, it's a bit wet, we can't really do much here, so we could cut down some of the trees and we could drain the land, and maybe we could use it for agriculture.
Yeah.
So one of the problems is they actually do this on a vast scale. So in the particular area that I work in Borneo, they deforested 1 million hectares of
really?
peat swamp forest. Yeah, that's half the area of Wales.
That's huge.
It is absolutely huge, and it was for kind of a noble goal, which was to make. It's called the Mega Rice Project, and what they wanted to do was make Indonesia self-sustaining in rice production. So you can kind of understand the reasons why.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, they didn't plan it properly, and the soil wasn't even particularly suitable. So they drained the land too much. They cut the trees away. the soil's really acidic and it's just no use for growing rice. And so actually this 1 million hectares was just abandoned.
Completely abandoned then, or?
It now looks a bit of a barren wasteland. I
Wow.
can't really describe it well enough, but it's as if, imagine just looking. I mean, we've all seen like peat and compost, yeah.
Yeah.
So just imagine, a whole landscape that just is that colour of peat, but with the occasional sort of skeleton of a tree root poking out of the soil.
It sounds like quite a sad landscape, really. Kind of tragic, with such good intentions of having all this kind of food production and then for nothing to come of it.
Exactly, and I think that's the biggest thing. It really is a bit of a tragedy, and also for the people that live there, because the forest really functions. Really helps control water levels. But now with the lack of trees, you get flash floods in the wet season, but also in the dry season, you have these really incredible fires. So. Where the peat, which, we use peat as a fuel.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned, the swamps of millions of years ago from the Carboniferous. So that was tropical peat that over geological time became coal. It's a fuel.
Yeah.
So if it's dry, it will burn, and you get a lot of smoke, a lot of pollution.
Yes, and that's one thing that we're going to talk about, really, because you did your fieldwork and you were there whilst there was possibly one of the biggest, was it the biggest disaster that they'd had in terms of these big fires?
It's been debated. So it was one of the top 3. So it's very difficult to quantify things just in terms of their effects, because they're sort of multifarious. They can be many things. But in terms of carbon dioxide release, it was probably second, I would say, compared to 1997, which was when they'd first cleared and abandoned the land. 97 was probably the worst year, but 2015 was, really bad. The main thing, though, the main thing that people notice is the smog, the haze. And so when I first started my fieldwork that year, the skies were clear. You could see the clouds. I mean, it's just so beautiful out there. And it was very strange that within pretty much a month, you couldn't see the sun, you couldn't see the clouds, you couldn't see the stars in the sky. Sometimes you couldn't see 20 meters in front of you. The smog was that thick, and it really, it affects people.
That must have been really quite something. I mean, to have to live there and there's nothing you can do about it, really, from their perspective. It must be very, very difficult.
It's you've really sort of hit the nail on the head there, because as a scientist and coming from the West, I was doing my research. It became so dry, there was no water. I had just puddles sometimes. That I was like, I'll just put my equipment there. And it just became impossible to work. And because the pollution was so bad, it was off the scale. All the air quality index, it just couldn't measure higher than 999 on this special index. And it was probably twice that. And so I was told, leave. And that actually was quite a difficult thing, because actually my field guides, the families that I knew, the people that I knew, they don't have that luxury. They just had to live with it until it stopped, and that could be months.
They don't have any escape or way of getting away from it.
Yeah, and even my field guide's wife was pregnant.
Oh my goodness.
So their child was actually was birthed during those times, and so I do remember actually when I got back, I was just checking the haze situation every day to see what was going on there.
Goodness.
Was it clearing up? Were the rains returning?
Any kind of respiratory problems and stuff that people might have, and that kind of levels of pollution, you just, goodness me, it's scary.
I mean, it's kind of it's been refuted by the Indonesian government, and I haven't really looked into it properly. But there was somebody did some research and thought that maybe up to 100,000 Indonesians could have died as because of that smog.
Goodness me. And do you think that the clearing of the forest in the peatlands, do you think that might have exacerbated the problem? Do you think that's...
It's entirely the problem.
Entirely the problem, yeah, exactly, goodness.
So, and the key really is water.
I think we'll bring it back to your... It's hard to move away from this topic because it's quite emotional, really. But we'll bring it back to sort of what your research is actually looking into. So are you looking and sort of at a specific problem within these peatlands? Are you comparing and contrasting various things?
I can hopefully tell you exactly that.
Yeah.
So really, the core of my research is about comparing the difference between the intact forest and the degraded forest in terms of carbon cycling. So we know that there are these vast carbon stores, that we are disrupting them. And normally these ecosystems act as a carbon sink. So what they do is they take up more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than they release. So they're taking in carbon, they're actually helping us deal with climate change. So the main problem is that when we get rid of the water and we deforest them, they become massive carbon sources themselves. So instead of having something that helps the problem, we've got something that's actually contributing significantly to it. And just to give you an example of that, the fires in 97 and 2015 could have released up to 40% extra CO2 to the atmosphere that humankind produces together globally. So just from this very small land area, we're adding an extra 40%. So it is big.
That's a big one.
So where does my research come in? So I'm comparing what's happening at these two sites. So we actually know quite a lot about what happens on land. It's quite easy to walk around, and we've got these big towers that measure gas emissions and things like that. So you can get some really good kind of terrestrial scale, landscape scale stuff. But there's also the channels and the rivers and the streams that drain the peats. So if you can kind of imagine like a river valley, and it rains in the valley, and it hits the soils, all the water passes through the soils and over it, and then into the rivers. Yeah. So you've just got to imagine that the water's just like picking up all this carbon and things like that and transporting it to the rivers. And so this actually acts as a major loss pathway for the carbon. So it's not just the like passive oxidation, the microbial action in the soil. It's also all of this carbon being leached out and dumped in the rivers. So it's moving out that way. And the other thing about rivers and channels is you can kind of think of them a bit like a digestive system. Okay. So there's loads of microbes and bugs and things like that in them, and so there's a large potential for the carbon to be broken down as it's moving through the river system. So what I'm doing is kind of measuring those rates of degradation, looking at what dominant processes are at work, how much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are being emitted from these water bodies. It's just kind of a bit of the jigsaw in just kind of understanding how the peatlands retain or lose carbon.
Okay, so you've got the carbon that's being transported into the rivers and then it's maybe being released. So how are you going about measuring this? What's kind of your field experiment that you're carrying out? How are you doing that? So
the main thing I've been doing is measuring greenhouse gas fluxes. So I basically fashion together these things called, well, I call them space hats. But they're really just glorified washing up bowls that I covered with aluminium foil tape to sort of prevent the sun from heating the chamber. But basically these upside down washing up bowls with a pool noodle strapped to them and some, a sophisticated little CO2 sensor inside. So basically these things just float on the water surface, and it logs the CO2 change within the chamber. And I also take sort of manual samples as well, so that allows me to look at methane and nitrous oxide.
Well, I'm pretty sure I've definitely seen some of those little space hats in the
Yes,
office.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we might be able to pop one of those up on the website so people can see what we're talking about.
No, absolutely, because they are a bit odd, but they're also great for keeping the sun off your head.
So do you, I know you said not many people live in the kind of the deforested part, and not many people would want to live in a peatland, but do you get many people coming up to you and going, what are you doing?
Actually, a lot. So this would usually happen. So some of the areas, if they're close to a road, usually if there's a road, there's some settlements. That does happen, and plenty of people. Usually it was on the river when I was going from place to place in a boat. So some people would be very curious. What are you like? Most of the time, I think I think they thought I was an oil prospector somebody that had come along to sort of like take some resource of theirs.
Yeah, I guess, that you could, especially when you're wandering around with your little space hats. And
No, exactly. You're walking, you're floating around with these really, bizarre looking contraptions.
Things.
Actually, another common misconception was the local people there are fisher people.
Right, sure.
They that is their their ancestry, their heritage. It's the people they came from. So when they saw these things floating around on the water, these silvery, they just didn't know what they were, and they thought I was catching fish. They thought I was taking their fish away.
Yeah, they'd be getting tips on fishing from you. And they'd be like, no.
Yeah, I mean, some of them saw me use a fishing rod and they knew I had no fishing skills.
You kind of get involved, don't you? Because you've got local guides that you work with as well. Do they ever have any of their own kind of ideas about what you should be doing with your research?
Well, my field guides were just spectacular. I mean, they weren't my field guides, they were my friends, and they were my brothers, and that's how we used to, we used to just call each other brother or pahari.
Yeah.
Kind of miss that word because it's been a while since I've said it.
You're quite fluent, aren't you, really?
I'm not too bad.
Yeah.
It's I ended up learning the local language there. The local people loved it because nobody makes an effort. The Indonesian, like the national language, that's what the outsiders learn. And I was the first person, I think, to really make an effort to do that. And
that's brilliant.
They used to say, "Oh, you're really clever. You're learning dialect," and the response you'd get from people was really surprising.
Yeah, I mean, just for the people who are listening, I mean, you're gonna stand out quite a bit because Matt has some brilliant blonde dreadlocks that he's supporting, and I can imagine that people notice those first off.
I'm probably the antithesis of Indonesian traditional style, So, over there, the men always have short dark hair. They've got dark eyes, and for somebody they're shaven, and for me to come along with these bright blonde dreadlocks, a ginger beard, blue eyes, people were, sometimes people were like, you are an alien. Yeah.
Oh dear.
And a lot of, actually, it's quite funny because a lot of the women would say, we need to cut your hair. It's a bit like my mum, really.
Yeah. You feel right at home.
So I think we
sort of wandered off topic. I was asking you, wasn't I, if you've had any kind of experience with your guides and if they've been really sort of had any useful pointers or things you should be doing and improving.
They were absolutely superb, and I do remember this one time where we went out, and I mentioned the sensors that I use, the carbon dioxide sensors, and there's this tiny little thing, you call it a jumper. And it just makes a little connection on the sensor to make it work. And so we'd got out to the field site after an hour and a half of trekking through peat swamp forest, you're pretty tired by then.
Yeah.
And then when you set everything down and you're like, okay, right, let's start work, and you're slapping yourself because of the mosquitoes or whatever, and, you know, and then you realise, oh, I forgot that little box with those little things in them which are absolutely critical to what I'm doing.
Oh my goodness.
And camp is an hour and a half away. So at the time, actually, I was a smoker. I don't smoke anymore, which is good. But I actually, so when we were, I just thought, right, there's no way we can start these sensors. And my field guide Idris, first I started like fiddling around, like trying to make a connection with some sort of metal. I was using syringes.
Oh, okay.
So I
that handy piece of field kit.
yeah. So I was taking gas samples, and we do those with syringes.
Yeah.
So I had the syringe needles. So I was trying to like clip them down with my Leatherman, and then like try and stick them on, but it just wasn't working. And Idris just had this amazing idea. He was like, use the foil from your cigarette packet.
Oh, okay.
And so I was like, yeah, let's give it a go. And so we just like folded, we just got a little bit of the foil paper and stuck it against the two connections, and it worked.
That
and
is
I was
genius.
Just like, it was absolute genius.
That
I
is
never would have
brilliant.
thought of it, you know. So he really saved the day, and you know, I think there are many instances, you know, especially when you're like troubleshooting. Like, because the weather is so crazy there, you know, sometimes you'd have like you know, the water level over a large area could go up 50 centimetres in
Wow,
a night.
okay.
You know,
Yeah.
it's
Is that
mega.
storms or just...
Just kind of normal rainfall.
Just rainfall,
it's
okay,
insane.
yeah.
It's really crazy.
Yeah.
And so all sorts of things can happen to your experiments because, you know, the craziest weather events can just occur. And it was just brilliant having my field guides there that, you know, just as part of their everyday life, it was about dealing with that environment.
They must have so much experience and kind of
Absolutely.
knowledge of how to deal with those kind of situations.
Absolutely, like, and some of them are just really genius, you know.
Yeah.
So it was really great because there was a kind of like knowledge exchange, and I think that's one of the things you'd really hope for when doing fieldwork.
Well, I think that's really important. And I know when I've been doing fieldwork and when I have had a guide, it's always really nice because you find that, okay, because I look at rocks and they're like, oh, like they're not going to find this particularly interesting. But actually, when you're looking through your samples in the evening, they'll be coming up to you and asking you, oh, what have you collected today? Oh, can I help you find anything? Like, oh, what am I looking for? And it's just really nice to be able to share that with people who live there.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we're just going in and taking our samples and leaving. And
there's so much enthusiasm sometimes, isn't there? And
oh my goodness,
it's just
yes.
like, wow, you're much more enthusiastic than some of the students I know.
Oh, and I know, and especially when it involves the field kit. Whenever I get out the sledgehammer, it just gets taken off me. They want to be swinging it. No, I think it's really nice to have that kind of local collaboration, be it with a field guide or with a researcher who's there, and like you say, they just have so much more knowledge than you can imagine, really, in terms of not necessarily the science part of things, but getting things done on a day-to-day basis, which is so important. Because otherwise, the field excursion can just fall apart.
Exactly. And so much, I think, so much of the success of fieldwork are these people that we work with there. I could, you know, without the incredible help, enthusiasm, dedication that my field guide showed, you know, like it kept me going sometimes, you know. And, you know, when the going gets tough, like just sometimes their light-hearted approach to things was just exactly what you needed.
Yeah, exactly. So do you think, because how I didn't ask how long you've spent out in Indonesia and Borneo, and what's the kind of length of time we're talking about?
So in total, it was about a year. Yeah.
A year.
Yeah. So I did that in fits and spurts of 2 to 3 months.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
So do you think you've sort of learned a lot from that experience, other than just the kind of the science that you've taken away from it?
It's just been completely life-changing.
Wow.
And I mean, I think, it's going to be one of those things that I will look back on in my life and just go, I'm so glad I just had the opportunity to do that. So I think it was a challenge because I was going out on my own, so I had to sort of do everything, work out all the logistics myself, and a lot of it was, it's kind of improv,
Yeah.
You're just kind of like just working out how things are going as you do it. And so it was really great to have that kind of, to experience that level of independence.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like, I'm planning my second field season, and it's crazy how different it feels this time, because I know that, okay, it's big and daunting, but you get out there and you just make it work.
Exactly.
and you can. Yeah, no, it is. I think that kind of fieldwork is, like you say, life-changing. It gives you a different perspective on things, definitely.
Yeah, I think one of the great things for me actually was when I came back the third time, or the fourth time. My usual field guide couldn't work for me, and there was nobody that could work for me from my organisation. So there was a bit of bad planning, or a situation that I wasn't expecting. But by that time, I was like, well, I can speak the language. I know a couple of people. I'm going to go to the village. I'm going to knock on doors. And I'm going to say, can you work for me? And that's how I ended up with one of my field guides who was just so brilliant. And it is really great when you get to that point and it's like, okay, I'm just going to make this happen, and you do.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Oh, it's so good. I could talk to you about this for hours. I'm just going to say that. So we've kind of summarised your kind of personal, what you've gained from this, but do you have any kind of take-home message from your research that you found whilst you've been out there?
Well, there's been lots of findings, but I think if it was for people at home, for them to know what was really important about peatlands, what should we do? What should we do to prevent these problems? And I would say just it would be about just keeping peatlands, keeping those swamps wet, and just somehow working with the environment. There's other ways of producing crops or producing suitable crops, but the main thing is we really do need to protect peatlands, just because they are so important for our climate, for flooding, for fires, for many things. And and with protecting the peats, we protect the orangutans and all of the wonderful life that lives there.
Yeah. Oh, that's really poetic and beautiful, and I hope that people listen and take on this advice, because I agree.
Yeah.
Well, it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you, Matt.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for coming on the show today, and thank you everyone for listening. We hope that you enjoyed this episode of Fieldwork Diaries, and that you join us again for more exciting tales from fieldwork with more exciting research. Thank you very much. My name's Eleni Woods. Goodbye. Fieldwork Diaries is produced at the Open University, and it wouldn't be possible without the amazing people behind the scenes. Music was written and recorded by the wonderful Matt Kent, and fellow fieldwork and podcast enthusiast Stacey Phillips has made us a beautiful website at fieldworkdiaries.com. Check out our Twitter at Fieldwork Diary and Instagram Fieldwork Diaries for live updates. Thanks again for listening.